Hi again, everybody. In this video, I'm going to be talking about using framing knowledge, like transitions, to include context appropriate to your situation and your document. So you might be asking at this point, why do I need to include framing language in my document? Doesn't that just make the document longer, and doesn't it just take the reader longer to get through the document? No. Framing actually sets up what's going to happen by providing critical information or forecasting in an outline. It's a guide through the document that can actually be very helpful for the reader. It might include directions about how to read the document or what to do with the overall document. And then in each section, this saves the reader time by showing the connections between the different ideas and the sections of the document, so that they can get an overall picture of how this particular information fits in with the larger document. This can be a lot less confusing than just encountering a bunch of information or data with no explanation or context around it. And it can actually be a lot more effective in terms of time, and it can take a lot less time to process this information when there is an explicit and directive frame for the information. We're not talking about lengthy, wordy, verbose sentences. This can really boil down to a single sentence or even just a phrase at the beginning of the section, but it does need to be there. Okay, here's a kind of funny picture at the bottom of the screen with a pizza, and it's describing that what's around the pizza, in other words, the context, definitely has a difference on how we view that pizza, right? So here's some strategies for framing. And we're also going to talk about some problems, some common problems that we're seeing as instructors with framing. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit about how you can use framing in your project best practices. Also, if you're still working on your revision for your project summary, and then in later communications. Okay, strategies for framing. So when do you need to use framing language? Where does that go in your document? It goes in the introduction, as we've discussed in the introduction video. It should also go in conclusions. This is your overall conclusion for your overall document, and it could also be a so what line in the end of each section to conclude that section. And then transitions. So this is information that comes at the beginning of each section. You should never have a section that has a section heading followed by another section heading of the subsection. You need some kind of explanation of what is in that section. Again, even if it's just a brief sentence. Overviews can be very helpful to tell the reader what's coming in that section. Again, this helps a lot in terms of effectiveness at processing the information. And then direct delivery of critical information. So in terms of when you're using framing in your document, you might use framing as a way to make sure that the key points stand out, right? Because again, a lot of information might be difficult to make heads or tails of. So you're going to want to boil things down with some critical information for your reader out in front. So there are some common problems that we see as instructors and as stakeholders in your project, right? As far as context goes in your papers. I like this little graphic here on the bottom of your screen, and it's very simple, and it's just showing the graph shows confusion and information and the relationship between those two. I think this makes a lot of sense because, as you can see, when you have not enough information, that can be very confusing. When you don't have any kind of context at all, it's super confusing. It can be really difficult to figure out what you're supposed to do with this document or why you're receiving it. Okay, and then on the other hand, Too much wordiness, too much information is also unhelpful. That also leads to confusion. You really want to get in that sweet spot where you have the right amount of information to reduce confusion. Okay. So common problems are missing information, not enough information. Please know that when you're explaining something, you're not necessarily dumbing it down. Explanations are necessary, especially for varying audiences and diverse audiences. So you need to know what information your audience might need and include that information. You might even consider putting that kind of information if your audience is going to need a glossary, for example, in an appendix to your document. That could be very helpful. Inappropriate framing or too much information, right, is also confusing. As I mentioned in one of the other videos, I've seen background information in introductions on the history of scientific phenomena or projects that is confusing in terms of how it really helps your reader understand what's going on here. So information that is out of place or inappropriate is also confusing. Finally, I want to present some different applications for framing in terms of your best practices report. You can refer to page 116 in your engineering communications book. We're also going to do an activity with some of those questions. I should say those are the questions that help you develop appropriate framing. So definitely check out that page in your book and come to class on Monday and we'll do an activity. Some of those include identifying the main idea. What's the main idea of this document? That'll help you contextualize. What's the purpose of the document? Who's the audience? Who's going to be reading it? And then more information about your audience. So these are topics that we've discussed before, but you need to think about them in terms of the context that you might want to add in your document and make decisions that are intentional about that. Okay, identify appropriate framing moves. Your framing, the amount of framing that you include really depends on the goal of each particular section in relationship with the larger document. Refer back to that audience analysis to make sure that you are framing things in an appropriate way for your specific audience. You can also ask the question, are there data that have been analyzed in this section? So that's one good clue that you might need a critical information statement, something that boils down and interprets that data with a key idea or takeaway. Okay, and then also a logical progression of ideas. If you can identify that there's a logical progression of ideas, then you're probably going to need an overview of those ideas or a what's coming statement. All right, folks, I hope this has been helpful for you. Stay tuned for more information, and I look forward to seeing you in class.